I have the unenviable task of dealing with people who are food coma, which I am as well, so I'm going to try to snap out. All right, so what I'm going to talk to, as Ian alluded to, is work on homeless youth and the ways in which technology has, in many profound ways, changed the experience of homeless youth. And so, as I was listening to the talks earlier this morning, I heard Sean, I've done some work with, we've written a couple of papers together, and he was saying, you know, this is really a revolution that we're a part of. And I think some of the work that I'm going to talk about today really addresses this idea of how much of this is a revolution and how much of this is not a revolution, and how much of this is the same old adolescent behaviors that we've always seen, and how much of this is actually something very new because of the opportunities that technology provides. And I think if it's not obvious at this point, my answer is it's a little of each. So let's talk a little bit, for those of you who don't know about homeless youth, about the context of homelessness in Los Angeles in particular. So I did a study with Tim Kordich, who's in the audience, from LAUSD, and some of our other collaborators are here as well. And we found that there's about 36,000 youth who experience at least one night of being literally homeless. That means sleeping on the streets or being in an emergency shelter every year in Los Angeles, in just the LAUSD school system alone. And LAHSA, the LA Housing Service Authority, reports that there's probably about 8,000 homeless youth between 13 and 24 on the streets on any given night. And HIV prevalence, which is why we're here, is alarmingly high in this population. The rates range somewhere between 2% on the low end and 11.5% on the high end. And really, this group of young people suffers from an enormous number of barriers to housing, barriers to health care, and what's really important to think about is the importance of their networks. And I think as we start to talk, or I start to talk more about their networks, it will become obvious how technology may be changing some of the aspects of this, and not for some. So where this is going, I think sometimes academics read a little bit too much. I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to talk about this, and by the time you get there, you've fallen asleep. So what I'm going to talk about is really the way in which social media in particular, but by social media, I'm kind of thinking about things generically, you know, cell phones, email, but really a lot of the action is literally on Facebook and other social media. This has really become a new opportunity for both influence for homeless youth in terms of their HIV risk-taking behaviors. It's a new source of resilience for homeless youth, and it opens up a whole set of opportunities for intervention strategies for us. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about. So we talked this morning already about how ubiquitous internet use is, so I'm going to get into talking in social network nerd terms for a minute, because this is, I think, really the crux of the issue here. So as a social network scientist, I'm really interested in points and lines. So these are people, and these are the relationships between people. And really, if you think back to prior to the advent of smartphones, prior to cheap cell phones, prior to internet access being in every single public library and every single social service agency in the country, the street life of homeless youth actually looked fairly different from what it looks like today, because they lived in a world that was basically made up almost entirely of other street youth. And so the standard story was, okay, you're a high-risk youth, you probably came from the foster care system, your parents were abusive to you, so you either ran away or you got thrown out, you end up on the streets, you experienced creation of a network of other youth who are basically involved in the same sorts of high-risk behaviors as you are, and everybody kind of normalizes the fact that, you know, using meth is a good way of staying up all night so you don't get victimized, and having lots of, having fairly rapid turnover in your sex partners is something that just happens because that's what everybody does. And so this was the sort of pathologizing story that we had about homeless youth for, basically since the 80s. Well, what some research just prior to things getting interesting technologically started to say, well, actually a lot of these homeless youth, when you talk to them about their social networks, will actually tell you, hey, I'm talking to my mom, I'm talking to my uncles and my cousins, and so we thought, okay, well, maybe things are a little bit more complicated than this. And so what I started thinking about a lot was, well, when my experience of homeless youth is that they're not all bad kids, right? And so a lot of these young people might be good kids. They might be green dots, not just red dots. So they're going to be spreading healthy behaviors in their networks. And I was really interested in this work. So as a good social scientist, I was out collecting my pilot data, and I was doing these qualitative interviews with these homeless youth that I'd basically been giving them socks and lunches for a few months, and then finally sort of built up enough trust that they would let me do some interviews with them, and I started doing some interviews with them and having them literally draw out by hand what their networks looked like on a piece of paper, and asking them, so who's a good influence on you? And they kept telling me about their friends from Detroit, and their mom who they haven't seen for 6 months in person, but that they talk to every day. And because I was over the age of 30, and it was 2007, I thought, what are you talking about? What do you mean you're talking to these people all the time? I have a record collection, vinyl records, with the needle in it. So I'm totally lost on this, and suddenly the kid looks at me like I'm completely from Mars, which from his perspective I was, and he says, MySpace. And I was like, what is that? And he said, it's this thing you get on, and we all were friends, and so I went and found out what MySpace was about. And in fact, this became sort of the major thrust of my research moving forward, was essentially the fact that it was not just that there was these pro-social, good kids in their networks, or that there were these family members in their networks, but it was that they were using social media to do this. So in my network science-y, geeky way, I've decided to draw some blue lines, not just some black lines, which are sort of the traditional face-to-face. Okay, so what did I do? I actually have about, maybe about a dozen different papers that I've written with various colleagues over the last 4 or 5 years where we've really tackled a lot of these issues in detail. And so I thought I'd just sort of share with you a couple of things that I thought were most interesting, that I think have some of the largest policy implications and programming implications, and then talk about where that's going to lead us in terms of intervention thoughts. So some of the major questions that drove really the early research that I was doing was, well, you're homeless, so how are you going to get online? And how frequently are you going to get online if you don't have a house? I mean, we in the West tend to think about social media and tend to think about cell phone technologies as something that rich people have. Because we remember the 90s, well, most of us remember the 90s, when people wandered around with these big bricks that were cell phones, and they, it was like some guy in a rap video with this huge cell phone, because he was a gangster who could afford such a thing, right? But we don't think about the context that, say, like Dallas is working on in India, where you have whole rural communities that have never had the infrastructure for landlines, and yet there's almost universal penetration of cell phones at this point because they're so cheap. So one of the things that we started to realize, or I started to realize as I started talking more and more with these youth, is that their capacity to get access to this technology was far greater than people thought. In fact, I did this survey in 2009 because I got clobbered in a grant review. I was talking to them about how these kids, they're on this thing called MySpace, and it's really cool, and they think it's really neat. We ought to do an HIV prevention intervention where we're using their networking over MySpace. And the reviewers came back to me very seriously, and much like I guess the review that Margarita got recently, and said, what do you mean they're homeless, they can't possibly get on the internet? That's nonsense, we're not going to fund such a crazy study. So I thought, well, I'd better collect some data and find out how many of them are on the internet. So I did a very simple study, and I'm going to share with you some of my older data, but I think it's also the easiest data to wrap your brain around before I got kind of more complicated about stuff. So did a simple survey, interviewed 200 youth, collected all this information from one drop-in center in Hollywood. That drop-in center sees kids that are literally sleeping on the streets, young people that are in independent living programs, young people that are couch surfing. The whole spectrum of street youth can be found at this drop-in center. And it's a convenient sample because this was pilot data because no one wanted to fund my project, so I was just doing this on my own. And we did a computer interview, self-interview. And so here's just some basic characteristics of these youth. It's a plurality. There's African-American youth in large numbers, white youth in large numbers, slightly smaller number of Latinos, lots of young people who identify as mixed race. There's a small number of trans youth, very small number, although there's a lot of non-heterosexually identifying youth in this population. There's other drop-in centers in Hollywood that serve LGBT youth in particular that tend to gravitate toward that drop-in center more so than the one that I was working at, which is a more straight identifying group of young people. So we asked them some simple questions like, how often do you get online? And what you find if you actually add all these bars up, which I probably should have done for you, is that 85% of them said that they got online at least once a week. So you don't have a home, you don't have a place to stay, that doesn't matter. You're still online at least once a week. And this is 2009, so this is before everybody's got a smartphone. So then we asked them, okay, so how do you get online if you're getting online all the time? And they said, first of all, we had a surprisingly large number, given that it was 2009, tell us that it was their cell phone, which to me, again, always being kind of behind these young people, I thought, wow, that's kind of amazing. I wouldn't have thought you would have had a cell phone, let alone a smartphone. And then we had, not surprising to me, was that the public library and youth service agencies were the main places that they were going. These young people are incredibly resourceful. I mean, I personally could not live in Los Angeles without a house and a job and a car, and they do all of those things, and they do it easily. Wow, time flies. And so they, they go to public libraries, youth services agencies. They take advantage of internet where they're staying. They will even do it at school, at work. They'll get it where they can. So who are they talking to? This is one of the really important questions. So who are their lines connecting them to? And what we found, surprisingly, was that there's just a really diverse set of network ties that they're connecting to. So it's other street kids, they're talking to people that they just met online, they're interacting with friends, they're interacting with family members, particularly brothers and sisters and cousins, people that are same generation. And so one of the things that we wanted to know was, well, does this have anything to do with your HIV risk-taking behaviors? And so we asked some pretty simple questions to get at some risk and resilience. So have you ever looked for a partner online? Have you ever been involved in exchange sex, so trading sex for drugs, money, a place to stay, food? Or have you ever gotten an HIV test? Or rather, have you gotten an HIV test in the last 6 months? And what we found was that who you're using the technology to connect to made all the difference in terms of whether or not you were engaged in these HIV risk or resilient behaviors. So if you were connecting with street peers, you were more likely to be involved in exchange sex. If you were connecting with your family, you were less likely to be involved in exchange sex. If you were connecting with your family, you were more likely to be getting an HIV test. And if you were connecting with your friends from home, not your street peers, you're more likely to get an HIV test. So another thing that's important, as I was thinking about one of the first slides today, the discussion about networks and then also information. So what are people using this for? So it's not just who they're connected to, but also what are they trying to get when they're online. So we asked some questions about how many of them were looking for information about sex, HIV, STI information, HIV information, and general health information. And again, we found that the numbers were really somewhat surprising that they were so high in terms of these young people reporting that they were doing these behaviors. And again, it was related very strongly to who they were having connections with and how easy their internet access was. So what we were thinking about this, so these are actually 2 youth that were in a pilot study of mine where we were doing a YouTube intervention where we were creating YouTube videos and disseminating them online. And some of the things that we've been thinking about is that maybe because a lot of high-risk social network processes are actually going on with their street network. So if you're connecting with other kids on the street, even if that's by social media, that's increasing your sex risk. Maybe we don't want to be thinking about these sort of peer-led diffusion models for these young people. Maybe that's not the best course of action. Maybe instead, what we should be thinking about is focusing on their pro-social networks and thinking about how can we create new connections to the positive networks. So Norita Milburn and I just put forward a grant proposal that hopefully will get funded, and I colloquially refer to it as Strive 2.0. She had created a face-to-face, family-based reunification intervention for new runaways. And what our thinking is now is that what we want to do is we want to make it something that one can deliver out of agencies so that instead of having to go to the homes of these families and do a 5-session conflict resolution intervention, which is how the original program worked, what we'll do instead is we'll train case managers to use Skype to talk with the youth in the office with them and then their family member who's this positive connection, who's probably at a great distance, and use that to build on these social supports and these resilient ties which seem to be so protective for these young people. So I liked the idea that Brian Mustansky had at the beginning of the morning, which was kind of go small or go big. And I think that this is an instance of us thinking about going small because Skype is free. Everyone knows how to use it by and large, and if they don't, it's pretty easy to teach them how to use it. And I think that the thinking that we're going with is that when you're thinking about disseminating work through community-based agencies, going small may be a really good way of going about things because you can't rely on a lot of resources, but there are a lot of resources that are free resources, and those are the ones that we can rely on. So rather than thinking about getting millions and millions of dollars together. So they need more internet access. We should connect them to their home-based peers. I think that we should even just let them fool around on the internet because YouTube never really hurt anyone. And I also want to get through these last slides so I can get to my acknowledgements, because this is really important to thank. Hey, I don't know why I had this all laid out like Margarita did, so it's slick. And now I lost my thing. That's really bad. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to acknowledge NIMH, who's been very, very kind to me and has funded me for 2 different studies that have supported this research. And Susanna Allison has been my program officer and has been very kind to me. And I also want to thank the youth of Hollywood, who are so generous with their lives and sharing their experiences. So thank you.